get us started. Thank you.
All right, great. Thanks very much, Susan. It's my pleasure to kick off our next plenary panel. Good morning, everyone. Starting from the earlier part of the morning, we talked about the political side of things happening in Asia. Then we, of course, transitioned to the economic side. This plenary panel will be focusing on religious changes in Asia's fabric, specifically looking at things happening in Myanmar, Sri Lanka, as well as the Mideast, wrapping in Islam as well. It's a very broad, geographic, as well as religious-themed panel here, but something very, very important. A quick introduction, myself, my name is Ramy Inocencio, and I'm a Bloomberg TV anchor based in New York. I'm actually an alum of the East-West Center's Asia-Pacific Leadership Program from 2009, getting up there, so it's been a while, but really happy to be here. More so about our esteemed panelists here. Let me just go down the line. Just next to me is Khin. He is hailing from Myanmar. And when you hear that he's a former political prisoner, then that, of course, raises your eyebrows. From 1994 to 2005, so a fairly long time there. He's now director of the Tampadipa Institute in Yangon, which engages in communal issues, nationalism, and international relations. Next up, we have Dilrukshi Handunnetti from Sri Lanka, a consultant editor of the Daily and Weekend Express, which is the first international newspaper published from Colombo, Sri Lanka. And then next to Dilrukshi, we have Bidhayak, also looking at things from Myanmar as well as from India, contributing editor based in Northeast India for the Irrawaddy, news website that covers Myanmar as well as Southeast Asia. And then Graeme on the left-hand side of the stage, hailing from Connecticut, national correspondent on terror as well as ISIS reporting for The Atlantic. Also was a 2015-2016 Edward R. Murrow Press Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and also is a lecturer at Yale University. Also a fellow recipient, as you mentioned, at the East-West Center. Same year, 2009 also, right? Yeah. All right, so let's hop into this. We're talking about fake news and the rise of Buddhist extremism, but we're going to expand that as well into jihadism too. I've asked everyone to prepare a story, a memorable story about fake news that they've seen, that they've covered. So let's go ahead and start with ladies first. Dilrukshi, talking about fake news, your most memorable experience working in Sri Lanka that you want people to know. And then we're going to go from fake news to motivations, a lot of it about fear, and then we'll move ahead into social media. So Dilrukshi.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. There are so many that I can think of, but one thing that gripped me with a lot of fear, personally, because I could not actually understand what exactly it was all about when I first saw it. It was a story that was circulated via Messenger, and there was this one video story of a group of Sinhalese, that's a majority community in Sri Lanka, walking into this eastern small eatery run by the Muslim community, an ethnic minority in Sri Lanka. So suddenly there was this discussion, and there was a lot of aggression subsequently. And it was all about, why were you introducing substances to my food? And did you not introduce something? And the whole idea was that, if you consume food from an eatery run by the Muslims, that you would eventually be impotent. So impotent. So they were making this connection because this also connects to another fear back at home, where the majority community feels that in numbers they are dwindling, whereas the Muslim population is increasing. So I could not understand why this was suddenly being shared, and it went viral, and there were similar things coming up. And 2 weeks later, there was this huge attack on the Muslims in the central parts of Sri Lanka. So originally there was no connection, but this was terrible to see. But I think it was really organized, and it was happening for a little while to create that fear psychosis.
Right. What was the impact in terms of hurts, or were there any deaths that came from this fake news video?
There were attacks, but I think people at that time showed a little bit of prudence, but until 2 weeks later, when we realized the full impact, it happened somewhere else. Because in the eastern province, I think people were a little more intelligent, and they also used common sense to at least control themselves. So there was no need for law and order situation to weaken at that point. But subsequently, there were 3 deaths. 2 weeks later, in Central Park, there were 3 deaths connected to her.
Wow, all right. Win, let me bring you in on this, looking at it from the Myanmar point of view. No doubt you've seen a lot of fake news over your time. What is the one most memorable thing that you want folks to know here?
Well, it's not a very pretty story, but you can't turn your face away, so let's just jump in. It happened about 6 years ago, almost to the day, June 2012. And it happened in Rakhine, where the state in Myanmar where the tension is highest. And there was a report that a young Rakhine Buddhist girl had been killed for her gold chain. And it also said that she had been raped before she was killed, murdered by 2 Muslim men. And that news went viral. And what happened was that just a few days later, there was a busload of Muslim pilgrims who were passing through that town, Dango. And all the Muslims were dragged down from their bus and brutally murdered. It came out later that, number one, there was no rape. She was just killed. And number two, the viral news came from the highest levels in Naypyidaw. Naypyidaw is Myanmar's capital, as you know. So it's not just rumors running around in the marketplace. It came from the highest level. So someone was, provoking people, mobs, and also instigating violence.
All right. Bidhayak, and to you, in terms of the most memorable thing here, just so we can illustrate to everyone the things that you guys, that these cultures are also facing.
Thank you for having me, and my voice is a little bad, did not have a very great night. But yeah, I'm just actually so surrounded by fake news, and a lot of things are happening back home. Lynching and lots of things. 2 friends died in a lynching incident very recently, but I'll not talk about that. I'll talk about something that's connected to Myanmar. And this was, I think, a month back when there was news in mostly all the Indian media, including the TV, that, Manipur state is in the northeastern region of India, for those of you who don't know, and this borders a lot of Myanmar Sagaing region, which is close to also the Khin state. That 2 Rohingya men were arrested for trafficking a Rohingya woman into Manipur. And that was all over the media. To me, that sounded a little funny because the Rohingyas coming out of Bangladesh from their camps in Cox's Bazar in Chittagong to Manipur, that's quite a distance. And I was wondering, why should they come all the way here and traffic the woman to Manipur, which doesn't make sense. But that was all over the media, and not only that, you had TV discussions that started simultaneously about how these Rohingya men and the women could actually be also linked to ISIS. That could be of interest to you, Graeme. And then I decided to actually do the little old school journalism, picked up my phone and called the police officer in this district and asked him that, sir, you've been quoted on this particular news about Rohingya, a woman who was trafficked. Is there any truth to this story? And he tells me that, we did not even mention trafficking. We said, yes, 3 people were arrested, and 2 of them had the UNHCR documents, which they are given in the camps, but they came illegally inside Manipur, and so we just detained and we were questioning them, and we found that the lady did not have any documents. So then they were handed over to a magisterial inquiry was conducted, and it was found that the lady was actually the wife of one of them. And then she came along with them. So that was the story. And then I think what the government, he said, was doing, the state government, the government of that province, contacted the Ministry of External Affairs for them to contact their counterpart in Myanmar to see that these people can be repatriated back. That was the thing. So what I did was I picked up the story, filed it in the Irrawaddy, but I said that this is not true, that there is no trafficking angle to this whole thing, but then this is also true that the community is very vulnerable and they can be trafficked. So that's the other thing that we've got to look at.
Thank you. And Graeme, looping you in here, as we were talking about this in our preps for our panel, it's actually, from your perspective, no or very little fake news. It's actually real stuff that's happening that's scaring the daylights out of people.
Yeah, with ISIS, ISIS in some ways is parasitic on a fake news environment, but in the sense that it is trying to differentiate itself by being remarkably forthright about the terrible things that it does. So there have been, over the course of ISIS's diminution of its territory, the besiegement of its cities, there have been these sort of like late Nazi era press releases about every little thing that has gone its way. And yes, it's true that it would decline to amplify the message of its defeats. But remarkably, over the course of its growth, and even really to this day, it has been extremely disciplined about not distributing fake news about its successes or supposed successes. So the number of times where a major operation was claimed that turned out to have very little to do with ISIS or nothing to do with ISIS is remarkably small. There's very few times when that's happened. So there was one case in Paris. There was an ISIS claim that came out very quickly about the Las Vegas shooting of last year. And there was one case of the casino rampage in the Philippines, which seemed to have nothing to do in retrospect with ISIS. So what ISIS has done instead is it has I think, taken advantage of the lack of discipline of many of its enemies, who are very happy to find any evidence at all of ISIS's crimes, ISIS's failures, and maybe be a bit less disciplined than ISIS itself in amplifying and reporting those stories when they've happened. So ISIS instead will sometimes, even when people say that something is ISIS related, ISIS won't claim it unless it's quite sure that it is an ISIS attack. So it has become a kind of player in this space that distinguishes itself, not entirely correctly, but with the image of a truth teller.
If I could push you a little bit deeper just for the psyche of things, why do you think they haven't done it yet?
Why haven't they begun pushing out fake news?
Yeah.
Well, its whole brand has been that we are the ones who are we're sincere, we're honest, we have nothing to hide, and it has done that simultaneously managing the information that happen, about things that happen within its territory. So it can manage that by, as I say, putting out the good news and just not reporting the bad news rather than denying it. So that image of sincerity is part of why 40,000 plus people would go to it, is because they're looking for, in a general global environment of distrust of media, distrust of information, distrust of governments, looking for at least someone they think will always be honest with them.
Right, that's
and they're fools for thinking that ISIS is the way to do that, but ISIS in some ways does get points for honesty compared to some of its enemies.
That's really interesting. Sincerity and authenticity from that perspective. Interesting, yeah. Quick question for our attendees here as we go geographically. Who here has been to Myanmar? Raise your hand, just so we know here. Okay, most people actually, more than 50% looks like, as well as Sri Lanka? Okay, good amount there as well. Okay, great. For those who don't, I want to establish on a foundational level some of the understanding for the religious slices of cultures as well as the governmental slices, because I think in our perhaps obviously for Myanmar and Sri Lanka, both a Buddhist majority, but just so we understand the fabric and the shifting schisms, I guess, that are happening. Dilrukshi, can you walk us through everything we need to know about Sri Lanka in the next minute?
I'll try. I think it's really important to understand where Sri Lanka actually comes from, the historical connection to religion, that we have always been identified as a Sinhala Buddhist nation. So there is ethnicity, there is also religion. So these two connections are really very important. When you say majority, there is an understanding that it is not only Sinhalese, it is also Buddhist by religion. And also the Temple of the Tooth in central parts of Sri Lanka is a very important religious institution, the most important religious institution. And there's also a lot of concentration of power in that institution because
Very quickly, Temple of the Tooth. Just
Yeah.
tell us a little bit more about that. It sounds, when I first saw it, sounds like an Indiana Jones saga. Something that you're going to go and the
Temple
rock's
of
going
the
to fall on
Tooth
you.
has a Buddha's, supposedly, the Buddha's tooth relic, one of the tooth relics. So therefore it is very holy for the Buddhists, not just in Sri Lanka, but elsewhere as well. So we have a lot of people coming there on pilgrimage. So what is important is that if the king did not defend this sacred tooth, you lose political power. So that remains true today, because even if a president is elected, the first thing he or she does is, we have only had one she, so everyone else has been a he. So everyone has to go pay homage to the temple and seek blessings, because there is that understanding that the president, who comes to lead the country, has to protect Buddhism. Because constitutionally too now, if we kind of fast forward that conversation to the present day democracy that we are, then there is a constitutional guarantee. There is a, everyone is equal, every citizen is equal, every religion is treated equally, but there is something called the foremost place being given to Buddhism. So there is that, extra edge, that slight high level of protection for Buddhism, and so much so that I guess every political leader has to toe a particular line, and they do, because these are also constituencies. The ethnic group, the religious group, they all are constituencies, so you keep playing that game. So, and also, I would also think that governments are the biggest manufacturers of fake news. Yeah, news as well as fake news. And you do create stories, you create a climate, you can create a climate of fear, you can use that to support constituencies, get support. It does happen, and it has happened in the recent past.
And in terms of the religious delineations, percentage-wise, recap that again. You said in terms of Buddhists as well as Indian and other minorities. Muslim and other minorities.
The Sinhalese ethnic majority community is about 72%, out of which about 67% would be the Buddhists. And then you also have Christians, and then you have the second largest ethnic group would be the Tamils. That would be 12% of the population, and they would be predominantly Hindu. There is also Christian population. The Sinhalese also have a minority Christian population. And then 10% of the community would be Muslims.
Win, also get us up to speed with the numbers, demographics, as well as religion. Of course, we all know what's happening in Rakhine there as well.
Well, as you know, in ASEAN and Southeast Asia, Myanmar is really the most ethnically diverse country after Indonesia. But the state doesn't recognize that. Well, just to give you the numbers, most of the Burmans, the majority of people are Buddhist. So ethnically, 70% are Burma, and then the rest 30 are composed of, 8 or, sometimes as many as 15 smaller ethnic groups. If you go by religion, since many of the Shan and Mon and Rakhine are also Buddhist, the percentage of Buddhists comes to 80%, and the rest, 20%, is composed of Muslims, Christians, and Hindus. Well, we had our first, most I say, comprehensive census in 2014, and that was 4 years ago. But the figures of the data on ethnicity have not been released. They will probably not be released. And it was said
right.
that...
Why is that? Because they just don't want people to know?
Yes, it's very sensitive, because around the corner we are looking at federalism, and it's a very extreme, territorial-based kind of federalism. Every ethnic group wants its own turf, literally, and they're going to fight each other for that, so there could be a lot of bloodshed. Going back to religion, in 2014, the unfortunate Rohingya in northern Rakhine were not counted in the census, and when the figures came out, the total population, 4% of the total population was categorized as Muslim. But my Muslim friends tell me that it's much higher than that. It could be as high as 10%. So there's a lot of fiddling with the numbers, I would say the second largest minority, religious minority, are Christians, because many of the hill people are Christian, most of them Baptists and also Catholics. So we have this very ethnically and religiously diverse country, which is dominated by the the majority group. And that caused the revolution.
Great, thank you. Bidhayak, you have covered so much in Myanmar, but as well as in Northeast India. I wanted to check in with you if you wanted to add to that, or if you wanted to contextualize your work also based in Northeast India.
Maybe just to sort of, I think, correct me where I'm wrong, but the Muslim population in Myanmar has been dwindling from what it was. If you predate it even before the colonial period, I think the size of the Muslim population, I think, was pretty much, close to what the Christian population is today. And because that time it was not Myanmar, you had different states, and like you said. But I think that population, and you've talked about the census, and I think for me, having stayed in that country for so long and having seen how the census was done and the way the advocacy for the census was done, I think a lot of the population that's in Yangon, the Muslim population, the minority, even they were left out from that advocacy that you have to come and register and get your name there in that list. I know during my interviews, I've met representatives of the Muslim Union in Yangon, and they tell me that even if enumerators came to their house and they interviewed all the members of the house, eventually it's only one person, either the head of the family, who got that. It's too colorful in Myanmar, you have different color cards. So it's the permanent resident certificate, I guess, which the head of the family gets. And the daughters, and I remember the wife of this gentleman, got a TRC, which is TRC is a temporary resident certificate. I don't know what color that card is. It's almost equivalent to what I get in Myanmar, which is an FRC, which is a foreigner registration certificate that I have to carry around. And I can tell you, we're talking about, I'm just trying to expand, and like I said, if you think, correct me where I'm wrong, there is also a small community, a Hindu community, that lives in a place called Irrawaddy, on the way to Naypyidaw. That the sixth generation that lives there, and they're essentially Bihari Indians who were taken by the British to do plantation work and all that, and they've lived there for a long time, the sixth generation now. Those people still today survive on just an FRC, which has to be renewed every year. It's a yearly renewal, but for me as an outsider who goes and works in Myanmar, I do a monthly renewal, but the community that I'm talking about has to do a yearly renewal, and they live on that FRC, and they can't speak any Indian language anymore. They speak Burmese, and they're completely Burmese in culture, in their appearance.
They were fifth or sixth generation there from Irrawaddy, right? No, that's amazing. Graeme, I want to bring you in on this, and I know you can't speak so much to the Buddhist aspect of things here, but wrapping you in to connect the dots from your expertise. And we were talking about how ISIS and other terror groups are trying to leverage what's happening in terms of the persecution between Buddhist extremists as well as the minority Muslim populations. Shed light on what they're trying to do when they loop in, say, for example, the Rohingya and Rakhine.
Yeah, ISIS will waste no time at all in finding examples like the persecution of the Rohingya and adding it to its kind of laundry list. The claim of ISIS from the beginning has been that if you're a Muslim, you can't live anywhere but an Islamic state, and a properly constituted one, and none exists other than the Islamic State. So it will be very happy to see cases of persecution of Muslims in countries where Muslims are a minority, and Myanmar would be one good example of that. Now, that said, adding Rakhine to the laundry list of cases where there's a Muslim minority that is not getting a fair shake, to say the least, I think that the marginal return for ISIS and adding that to that list is probably also smaller than people might think. ISIS will definitely use that, but it's so unfriendly to Muslims in general, unfriendly to the ways that they prefer to live their lives, that it will, although it'll say Muslims are persecuted there, it will decline also to lionize Burmese Muslims, decline to lionize Rohingya, because they say they're not proper Muslims. there's a minority within them who might be excited about going to Syria, going to any of the peripheral territories of ISIS, but they, in a way that Al-Qaeda would happily use that and really run with it in a way that I think ISIS has not. So because of ISIS's just general distaste for how Muslim lives are lived outside of the Islamic State.
Interesting. In your notes that you sent over, just one thing, just to bring this up, you had said, what did you, Rohingya, expect? You're living sinfully in a non-Muslim land. You kind of deserved it. And that's the mentality, huh?
Yeah, that's the words of ISIS that I'm ventriloquizing,
not you,
not
no.
my own. But yeah, they would say, look, what has your life looked like in Burma? What does it look like? What type of Sharia are you imposing on yourself? You've lived sinfully and you have not fulfilled your obligations. So although we will add you to the list of Muslims who have been oppressed, it's kind of on you too.
Wynn, you wanted to hop in.
Add something just to broaden and fill up the picture. The Rohingya have an armed organization. It's called ARSA, Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army. And the narrative now, we don't know to what extent it's confirmed, is that from the Myanmar security apparatus and also from India and also from China, that ARSA has links to ISIS. And
You repeat that one more time, just a little bit.
that this ARSA, A-R-S-A, the Rohingya Armed Organization, which is very small, has links to ISIS. And then some of them have received training in Karachi or in Saudi Arabia or in Afghanistan, but we don't know how credible that is, but this is exactly the kind of narrative that the security people like. So, okay, these are terrorists, so we have to come down hard on them. Let me tell you, it was in the Myanmar newspapers. The ARSA were carrying just rusty knives, not swords, and wooden guns. Of course, they had a few automatic rifles, and they just attacked the police and army outposts just like that in the nights. Many of them were killed there, So we have to really see what the real links are. I know Bangladesh has a big problem with terrorism. There was an attack on the diplomatic enclave and also other Muslim countries like Indonesia and Malaysia. But I think we have to be a bit more circumspect in seeing what the real links are. As far as I know, as Graeme was saying, well, the Rohingya are closer to Rakhine than even to Bengal or to Bangladesh. And theirs is a different kind of Islam, a different kind of culture, much closer to us. And that is not recognized at all. They all run together as alien and, under the total influence of terrorism.
Just want to add to that, and the ARSA, the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, is definitely not a ragtag band, as has been portrayed in the international media, because they carry weapons, and they have been responsible for weaponizing information that's on Facebook and social media. And that's gone viral, and that's also not done any good to the situation. But they, I think, provide that space, like Graeme was saying, for the ISIS. And I know back home, the ARSA has been connected to separatist groups in Kashmir. And there have been photos taken of them in Kashmir and in Karachi, where they've apparently received those trainings. We don't know. But there have been reports like that in the media, and like you said so correctly, that narrative, I think, is picked up by the security agencies, and that's been the center of the debate, at least in India. If you open up any television channel today, and if you watch a Rohingya debate, I tell you, you will be either mesmerized or you will be devastated. Because the debate is not about Rohingya, about the problem, about what the cause of that problem is. It's about ARSA getting that entire community towards ISIS, towards Al-Qaeda, and they also talk about the Taliban as in because some people were seen in Afghanistan. So that narrative actually is creating a kind of a phobia, which is the Islamophobia, that drives, I think, most of the narrative even in the mainstream, particularly in the mainstream media. And that feeds into people's mind, for constantly, if you're doing that every day, you tend to also start thinking like that sometimes, that yes, probably there is some truth to that. Right. And that's how people react, the general masses in India and Northeast, because our borders are so porous. And there is migration happening. And I come from Northeast India, and I was just telling my friend, and this is just a quick thing that I want to share. an uncle of mine was beaten up yesterday, again connected to fake news, because we grew up with this racism in my part of the world, because we are migrants from Bangladesh, and he's hospitalized. I don't know what's happened to him, and that's caused a little agony in my mind. So I've lived with that, and I know. But then, these narratives that sometimes, therefore, can act dangerously in the mind, and I can start thinking that, yes, the security narrative is something which is probably real, and we must go with that.
As Marissa told us yesterday, if you tell a lie a million times, it then becomes a truth then, right? Yeah, Graeme, you've been wanting to say something.
Yeah, I think we have to be very careful, as you say, that the way that ISIS affiliates are portrayed, what does it actually take for them to qualify as an ISIS affiliate? Do they just have to have one of those black flags behind them at some point? Do they have to just say, I'm an ISIS affiliate? The way that ambiguity can be weaponized by both sides really repays careful study. As has been said, security forces would be very pleased to see that an armed opposition in Rakhine would have an ISIS association. ISIS itself, though, is often very careful about who it takes on. There have been groups that have said, they've raised their hand and say, we want to be an ISIS group, and ISIS has said, no, thank you. We don't want you. We're not sure that you are on board for all the things that we want. Now, the fact that we don't really know, even in the case of someone who says we agree with ISIS about everything and ISIS says no, that means that the precision with which we have to report this, it has to be extreme. We have to say exactly what those ties are rather than just saying that this group is an ISIS group, that this group has ISIS ties. Because that kind of imputation can be super dangerous and often unfair.
I mean, and you being the expert, of course, you know this, but the granularity, you just have to call into question a reader or a viewer, would they even be able to parse that, or would they even care, right?
Yeah, it used to be the case with Al-Qaeda. It was a conspiratorial organization. You weren't part of Al-Qaeda unless you were very close to Al-Qaeda. Now, with ISIS, since it's sort of a mass movement, the links can be much more flexible. And so, again, the precision that we have to use when talking about this has to be really high.
Interesting. So then the lesson then for reporters or us as consumers of news is to really know and to really report as deeply and as, I guess, specifically as possible there in that sense. All right. I want. Okay. Sure, sounds good. All right, so let's open to a couple questions. I wanted to go into some social media, Facebook stuff, but maybe if you wanted to ask that as well, we'll go ahead and do that. Why don't we take two questions right now? Number one and number two. Mike Reiner to the front, please. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Andy from Indonesia.
Just a little louder, please.
Sorry,
Thank you.
I'm Andy from Indonesia. You talk about cases of fake news, but you have not talked about hate speeches, which is actually probably a worse problem than fake news. And my question is, hate speech that plays into the sentiments of the religious communities, and then these are being amplified by the media, both mainstream and the social media. How big a problem is that in Sri Lanka and in Myanmar? How much is the culpability of the mainstream and social media in raising up the hates, the sentiments against the religious minorities? On ISIS, you mentioned that ISIS has been disciplined in telling the truth, but they have a very powerful propaganda machine. They use YouTube very effectively in recruiting jihadis from all over the world, including Indonesia. Can you talk a little bit about that propaganda machine and how effective has it been? Thank you.
Great. And then why don't we go ahead and start with this? Dilrukshi, why don't you take this first in terms of culpability in the mainstream and hate speech?
I guess I will have to definitely agree with you, because it's fake news only leads up to the next thing would be hate speech. And hate speech has been prevalent for the past few years so strongly that I would like to refer to an incident in March this year. And this was when there was violence, as I mentioned earlier, there was violence targeting Muslims in the central parts of Sri Lanka. And the kind of videos, the kind of stories that came on Facebook, the kind of exchanges on social media was such that the Sri Lankan government decided to temporarily ban Facebook, Viber, and WhatsApp. And that was for 3 days. And then they have been having discussions because of the intensity of the kind of communication and it going viral and its impact and the inciting of violence and hatred among communities, dividing people, bringing out all those ethnic, religious sentiments that can be used positively, but this time around it was really, really outrageously violent. And so the government then appointed a committee to look into it, and they also brought down a Facebook team. There are discussions, there are serious disagreements, but the fact that it needs to be looked at and seriously looked at is something that is being considered by the state. And also the criminalization of hate speech as a separate crime. That is also another thing that is being considered. I don't think the question is being answered yet, but so many things to be done. And the fact that there is recognition that it's really gone way too long, and its impact is really, really terrible. So it needs to be addressed, and it is to some extent being addressed at the state level. But we have no clue as to what exactly the process of making the criminalization of hate speech, and the whole process is not yet very clear.
Can you couch the momentum or the support in terms of where it's at right now, at least, if not the timeline?
In terms of?
In terms of the support or the momentum at the executive level or at the congressional level?
I guess, again, that it's a divided debate, because people, of course, for the moment, the media has not come on board to say that, would you like to have, for example, do you want a law on fake news? I mean, are we going to try and follow the Malaysian example? Because that's supposed to be the one that is being discussed by the state rather seriously. So we are not too sure about that. But there is a growing understanding that this kind of hate mongering needs to be dealt with. But whether the state is the right agency to be doing so, and whether imposing law would be the only way to tackle it is another thing. But we are pretty weak in promoting interfaith groups and their understanding, which was necessary, because in post-war, this was one of the key mandates of the new government to look at accountability mechanisms. And one of that was supposed to be that you would also look at introducing mechanisms to introduce some kind of harmony among communities, because we are quite polarized. Because there is majoritarianism post-war, especially because there's a lot of triumphalism. The Sinhalese feel that they have conquered, and there is this defeatist element at the other end, that the other ethnic groups think that they are marginalized, they're subjugated. So all these things come into play.
Right, thank you. Win, let me bring you in here in terms of your perspective on what's happening in hate speech in Myanmar.
Well, I'm very glad that yesterday this was really broached, and we covered quite a lot of ground. It's very relevant to what's happening in Myanmar today. You see, someone mentioned yesterday that Myanmar took a steep climb, from less than 5% internet coverage to it's over 70 now. And the thing is that much of the hate speech is on social media, and it's on Facebook. I, for one, do not blame Facebook for it. Facebook is just a tool of communications, like a telephone. It's the people who use it who are at fault. Now, you see that in the weeklies in Myanmar, Facebook is running full-page ads, just aimed at curbing hate speech. And I think it's the right thing to do. And I think there are other people who are involved in this, like civil society, interfaith groups, place a lot of faith in them, and also youth activists, working on this. Strangely enough, the state is not doing enough. They put a curb on one of those firebrand monks. You've heard about him, U Wirathu. He was barred from preaching for a year, but he's back. And he has powerful backers behind him. Remember that. He's not acting alone. See? And on the theme of Buddhist extremism, I would even say that it's a misnomer, and it's also a contradiction in terms. If you're a true Buddhist, you cannot be an extremist. You've heard of the Buddha's middle way. So I would say, rather than use Buddhist extremism, you can call them extremists who are hiding behind a cloak of Buddhism or a mask of Buddhism, so that kind of thing. So we are working on it. Society, the public is working on it. I would really like to see the state do more on this, And the state is not doing enough precisely because they don't want to jeopardize the Buddhist majority vote. Elections are going to come in 2 weeks. And it's in 2 years. So it's a resumption of democracy, but majoritarianism and electoral democracy and, too much of emphasis on getting votes.
So you're basically painting a picture where there will be no movement from your expectation here then?
It's a kind of an equilibrium, you could call it, or kind of stasis. But the real impetus will have to come from activists, people, public intellectuals, and also from the media. I have great admiration for the Myanmar media. Yesterday, one of my young colleagues, he was a little bit dejected. But I have great admiration for the Myanmar media. They are standing up very strong. Many of them are behind bars, and we have a long tradition of the media speaking out for freedom since colonial times, But as I say, I repeat, the state, in Myanmar it's a dual state, is a disappointment.
Yes, I think we had one back here. Yes. Go ahead and stand up, please. Yes. Just very quickly. Thank you.
Okay, I'm Abdul Manan from Indonesia. I will asking about the Rohingya issue because Indonesian people take very attraction on Rohingya. I just wondering what the biggest challenge for Myanmar journalists to cover this issue.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
What the biggest challenge?
The biggest challenge?
What the biggest challenge for Myanmar to cover Rohingya issue?
The biggest challenge to cover the Rohingya in Myanmar?
I would say on the side of the government is to repeal the citizenship law. It dates from 1982, which was the period of the dictatorship. I don't think it was even went through parliament. And the strange thing is that it's being accepted, even now. That's number one. Number two is that society, again, I speak about it because we've lived under a military dictatorship for half a century, and that's bad. We have to make them aware, that handling the Rohingya issue has great implications for a tolerant society, a diverse society, and a plural society. It could be the Rohingyas today, and tomorrow it could be the Kachins. There's a full-fledged war going up there in the north, and people tend to ignore that. There are hundreds and thousands of IDPs out there in the monsoon rain. It could be the Shan, So if we don't change society and the way that the Burman state operates, and have more tolerance, there could be further disasters down the line. It's not just the Rohingya issue itself, which is bad enough. I think we have to look at, a broader range of challenges which we have to meet.
Just in the interest of time, I think we have one person over there. Yes, Syed. Just your question, really quick.
My name is Syed, and I want to bring Graeme into this. India happens to have the second largest Muslim population, but it has no connection with ISI. How do you see from US this particular phenomena? Thank you.
Did I understand the question properly? India has a very large Muslim population, but no connection with ISIS?
Second largest population in the world, but no sort of affiliation towards ISI. ISI has not been able to cut any ice. Neither Al-Qaeda has been able to cut ice into Indian Muslims, which are, I don't have to tell you, the kind of sufferings in which Indian Muslims are going under this time. No, I'm talking about Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. Not the ISI of Pakistan.
Yeah, I understand. Okay. So the question is, well,
thank you.
Why Indian Muslims have not been flocking to ISIS, which I think is one of the most fascinating stories of things that haven't happened that has to be watched more carefully. I think some of the reasons for that are that there are political outlets for Muslims in India that don't exist for Muslims in many other places. There is also, I think you're probably aware, there are cases of Indian Muslims who have gone to ISIS looking for the utopian society that ISIS was promising, and then finding something quite different, and who have returned and have had comical stories of being treated very, very poorly by leaders of ISIS, by ordinary ISIS fighters, and discovering that upon arrival in Syria, they occupied this kind of lower social status that they might find if they were to become guest workers in say, the Gulf, rather than heroic fighters. So I think seeing how India has succeeded in making sure that there is very little appetite for ISIS is probably one of the most fruitful ways of looking at countering extremism anywhere.
All right. We've run out of time, but this conference with fake news and things, especially even our panel here, has been relatively, I guess, darker is what I've been talking to a couple of people than in years past. I don't want to leave on a dark note. I'm a positive person at heart also, and I think speaking to these folks here, they are as well. What is something positive that's happening that you want people also to know, that it's not just doom and gloom and for us to walk away depressed out of here? So, Win, you go ahead and start.
Well, yeah, no matter.
Yes, just very quick.
No matter how dire the situation is, well, I really have hope in my own people. The activists, the young people especially, the press, civil society. So no matter how, let me use this word, how dumb the state can be, I think society will prevail in the end.
Great. Dilrukshi.
I think the attempt to deal with hate speech is a positive thing. And how you're going to define hate speech is entirely another matter, and that's another debate. But again, the accountability mechanisms that the government is looking at should consider situations like this and take steps to prevent further violence from taking place.
Bidhayak.
I think for me the positive story in Myanmar, and I say this everywhere, wherever I go, I think the democracy movement is on. It is moving forward. To say that whatever is happening, the problem is there, but let us not rock the boat, because the movement and the transition is going forward. The problems are there, and you can't have an overnight solution. What is of concern in all that is that there seems to be a polarization in the media, the international media and the national media, that seems to be diametrically opposite when it comes to certain issues, maybe the Rohingya, the Kachin and all that. I think that is where we need to have the media coming together and understanding the context. If the international media is willing to understand the context, and the national media is also willing to understand that the international community has a certain interest in the in the value of humanity, then I think things can become good. And I think the Myanmar experiment is an experiment that needs to be looked at from a different perspective. It's just not, we can't see the woods for the trees. It's like that kind of a situation. It should not be like that. We should look at it in a holistic manner. Thank you.
And Graeme.
Just very quickly, I think that one of the positive things we can look at is simply journalism of the most old-fashioned kind. When we think about what's dangerous about the fake news environment, what can be done about it, I don't tend to look toward things like criminalization of hate speech, which in my country at least is not a legal category, and will not become one anytime soon. But instead the sort of the tools that we all as journalists have learned to use. The first day in a newsroom, you're told you see it or you source it or you don't report it. And I think that set of tools, which we all know, it's in our DNA as journalists, those remain accessible to us, and they are the best weapons against fake news environments.
Great, thank you. Fight the fight, fight the fake. A round of applause, please, for our terrific four panelists here. Very, very insightful. Thank you so much. Win, Dilrukshi, Bidhayak, as well as Graeme.